Some things are a passing trend. Some things go completely out of style. And some things, they are eternal, timeless. Just like the premium service from our sponsor today. When you lock in their premium tier, you are securing flawless, top-tier service that doesn't expire. It's an upgrade for life. January 1953. The Soviet Union was humming along to its usual rhythm. Nobody knew that in just 2 short months, the entire country would be swept up in a tidal wave of massive historical changes. But for now, everything was exactly as it had always been. Bureaucrats were stamping reports in their cramped offices, factory workers were grinding out their daily quotas, and criminals, well, they were doing what they did best. They were robbing people blind. On a seemingly normal afternoon, a group of young men walked into a state savings bank just outside Moscow. They moved with purpose. Within seconds, the front door was locked. Heavy steel pistols were drawn. "Everybody face down on the floor," one of them barked. The female tellers tried to raise the alarm, but a pistol whip to the skull silenced them. The crew started bagging every single ruble in the vault. But then the telephone on the desk started ringing. One of the robbers, running on pure adrenaline, picked up the receiver. "This is the savings bank. Comrade, you have the wrong number. This is a stadium," the robber blurted out, slamming the phone back down. The person on the other end of that line was the dispatcher from the local police precinct. One of the tellers had actually managed to hit the silent alarm. So why did the cops call instead of rushing the building with sirens blazing? Incompetence, lack of experience. They figured they should call and double-check if a robbery was actually happening before wasting the gas to drive out there. Brilliant police work, right? The dispatcher eventually sent a single beat cop to check it out. The cop knocked on the locked front door, got no answer, and wandered next door thinking he had the wrong address. By the time the police actually breached the bank, the crew was long gone. They vanished into the winter air with 30,000 rubles. To put that in perspective, that was enough cash to buy 2 brand new, top-of-the-line luxury cars. On that cold afternoon, the Moscow police narrowly missed capturing the infamous Ivan Mitin gang. For over 3 years, this crew had been terrorizing the region, cleaning out stores, kiosks, and banks. But they weren't just thieves. If someone got in their way, they killed them without a second thought. Historically, this very crew is considered the real-life inspiration for the legendary Black Cat Gang. If you know your mid-century literature, you know them from the famous novel The Era of Mercy, which was later turned into a massive television event where hardened detectives hunted down a hunchbacked mob boss. But tonight, the monsters we are looking at are not your typical textbook serial killers. They didn't lurk in the shadows wearing trench coats. On the outside, these guys were model citizens. They were athletes. They were award-winning factory workers. They were regular guys with no obvious psychological deviations. And honestly, that is exactly what makes this so terrifying. By sheer body count, this real-life Black Cat Gang outpaced many of history's most notorious serial killers. And they weren't the only ones. Across the country during those years, other syndicates were committing acts of violence so depraved they rivaled the worst sadists in human history. In this episode, we are pulling back the curtain on the major criminal syndicates of the mid-20th century Soviet Union. Where did the legend of the Black Cat actually come from? And who was really painting that symbol on the walls? We are going to find out exactly how detectives tracked down the real gang that inspired the movies. We'll uncover why police were actively forcing violent criminals to retract their confessions. And we will see how a simple barrel of beer and a visit from a foreign head of state tied this whole bloody mess together. This is the Serial Number series. We look at the darkest killers and criminals through the shattered lens of history, culture, and politics. My co-host Alexander is linking his channel down in the description. Make sure you subscribe. Let's begin. The Ivan Mitin Gang and the Black Cats of the Soviet Union. Serial number, episode 21. February 1st, 1950. A police detective and a beat cop were walking their usual patrol route. They stepped into a local grocery store and immediately locked eyes with a group of strange young men who were loitering, seemingly waiting for the shop to close. The woman behind the counter leaned over and whispered that one of these guys had just flashed a badge, claiming to be a police officer. The detective walked over and asked to see their papers. The men didn't reach for their wallets. They reached for their guns. The detective was shot dead on the linoleum floor. The killers bolted out the door and sprinted toward the main highway heading north. Less than a decade earlier, the soldiers of the Nazi war machine had marched down these exact same roads in their steel helmets. Now in peacetime, some street punk had gunned down an honest cop and escaped down that very same highway. 2 months later, in the northern districts of the capital, a dry goods store was hit. This time, the crew claimed to be agents of the Ministry of State Security, the terrifying intelligence agency that would later become the KGB. These fake federal agents locked the clerks and a few unlucky shoppers inside a back storage room and completely cleaned out the registers. They walked away with 68,000 rubles, an absolute fortune. The witnesses all agreed on one detail. The guy giving the orders was a tall, strikingly blond young man wearing a leather coat with a distinct patch on it. That was the exact same description the terrified grocery store clerk had given after the detective was murdered. By the end of 1950, a wave of identical, highly coordinated robberies washed over the city. The crew had a signature style. They targeted shops on the northwest side of the city and the surrounding suburbs. They forced everyone face down on the floor or locked them in closets and stripped the places of all their cash. By December, their total haul was north of 150,000 rubles. And they were arrogant. They seemed to actually enjoy the psychological torture. They would wave live grenades in the faces of terrified female cashiers. In one sickening instance, they forced a female clerk to shove her head inside a burning stove. It wasn't to get information, it was pure humiliation. They just wanted to show her that they held her life in their hands. The poor woman laid there, completely paralyzed by fear, with her head in the oven, until the police finally arrived. Witness reports varied wildly. Sometimes there were 2 guys, sometimes 3, sometimes 4. One witness swore a robber was wearing a bizarre homemade mask fashioned out of an old military gas mask. But the one constant, the one thread tying the chaos together, was the tall blonde kid calling the shots. But it's a big city. There are a lot of tall blonde guys. The police didn't officially link the crimes right away. Still, the temperature in the room was rising. You have an armed, highly organized syndicate operating on the edges of the capital. They are perfectly willing to pull the trigger, and they are completely untouchable. The detectives assumed they were dealing with hardened, old-school mobsters, maybe veterans of the pre-war criminal underworld. In May of 1949, detectives in the capital finally cornered a guy named Pavel Andreev. On the streets, he was known as Paulie America. If you've seen the classic crime films of the era, you might picture an elegant pickpocket working the crowds. But the real Paulie America was no pickpocket. He was a ruthless armed robber and a cold-blooded killer. Paulie put together a crew that hit 3 different stores in a single afternoon. They made off with 120,000 rubles. Over the course of that day, they murdered 4 people who had the bad luck of standing in their way. Later, they ambushed 2 women carrying payroll for the city's financial institute. You have to remember back then, they didn't transport payroll in armored trucks guarded by men with tactical shotguns. It was usually just a couple of female clerks carrying briefcases or canvas sacks stuffed with cash. All the crew had to do was figure out the route and the schedule. Those women never had a prayer. Paulie's crew gunned the women down right in the lobby of the institute. It wasn't just a robbery, it was an execution. One of the women was shot in the head twice while she was already bleeding out on the floor. Paulie's gang raked in over 250,000 rubles. But in a tightly controlled, planned economy, how do you even spend that kind of money? You can't exactly buy a mansion. You can't buy 10,000 pounds of prime steak and sleep on it like a cartel boss. But in the capital, if you knew the right people, you could live like a king. There were underground restaurants, black market luxury clothes, and expensive imported food. After the war, the black market was flooded with captured German goods, cameras, motorcycles, and automobiles. With 250,000 rubles, you could buy 15 of those top-tier luxury cars. We use those cars as a metric because back then owning just one was the ultimate, undeniable proof of your status in society. Speaking of breaking out of your routine and exploring the world, if you feel stuck in an endless loop of the daily grind, you need to check out our sponsor, Tripster. Their platform hooks you up with talented local guides who will make you fall in love with any city, even the one you've lived in your whole life. Click the link in the description. Download the Tripster app and use the promo code to get a 10% discount on any booking through the end of July. Paulie America actually used one of those high-end luxury cars as his getaway vehicle. The police eventually found it abandoned and managed to pull fingerprints off the steering wheel. The Soviet police had been building a massive fingerprint database since the 1920s, so they got a hit almost immediately. The prints belonged to Andreev, a career thief who had spent the entire Second World War sitting in a prison cell. But he wasn't living at his registered address. He was moving like a ghost using expertly forged documents. The gang leader was living under the alias of a high-end fashion designer. And honestly, the guy loved fashion. He was obsessed with the classic American gangster aesthetic. Fedoras, tailored leather trench coats, sharp suits, polished wingtips. That's exactly where the nickname America came from. But this bargain bin Al Capone was ultimately brought down by his own ego. He loved the high life too much. Paulie was a regular at the restaurant inside the legendary National Hotel right next to Red Square. He threw cash around like it was worthless. Rumor had it he practically owned a private table there, much like the black market billionaires who would take over the city a decade later. Detectives knew exactly how to hunt guys like this. They understood the psychology of men who came into fast, bloody money. They staked out the luxury spots. Soon enough, they spotted a guy matching Paulie's description and started tailing him. Who was he meeting? What is he doing? It didn't take a genius to figure out that this humble fashion designer was living way beyond his means. The final nail in the coffin came from his own girlfriend, a petty pickpocket who flipped on him. Though there's a more grounded theory that the cops actually squeezed his personal document forger, who gave up Paulie's fake identity and his hideouts. Either way, the cops kicked down the door and took Paulie America alive. After his arrest, Paulie was incredibly smug. He knew the law. He knew for an absolute fact that he wasn't going to face a firing squad. In May of 1947, while Joseph Stalin was still in absolute power, the government issued a decree abolishing the death penalty. Officially, this was done by the overwhelming request of the workers and the public. Execution was replaced by a 25-year sentence in the Gulag system. They even commuted the sentences of guys who were currently sitting on death row waiting for the bullet. High-ranking officials called it a monumental act of socialist humanism. On paper, they tied the abolition to the end of the Second World War. The official decree stated that the historic victory over the enemy proved the absolute loyalty of the people, that peace was secured, and that the death penalty was simply no longer necessary in a peaceful society. But we've looked at the history of crime enough to know that you always have to read between the lines. There was a massive economic incentive to abolish the death penalty. The country was in ruins. Entire cities had been leveled. They were facing a catastrophic labor shortage. They needed warm bodies swinging pickaxes in the labor camps, not rotting in unmarked graves. There was a political angle, too. Stalin wanted to send a signal to the political elite. He was giving them a twisted sort of guarantee. You might fall out of favor. You might lose your job, your apartment, and your status, but you will keep your life. It was also a highly effective propaganda weapon against the West. While the Soviets claimed to have evolved past capital punishment, the West was still actively executing people. Britain wouldn't stop hanging people until the mid-1960s, and the United States, in the mid-1940s, America was executing over 100 people a year. This was exactly the era of the infamous Willie Francis case in Louisiana. Francis was a 16-year-old black kid sentenced to the electric chair for murder. The case was a mess. The confession was shaky, evidence mysteriously vanished from police lockup, and his court-appointed lawyers didn't even put up a fight. The whole trial lasted 2 days. Given the brutal racial dynamics of the Jim Crow South, it sadly wasn't unusual. But the case made global headlines because the execution failed. A drunk guard improperly set up the portable electric chair. Francis was hit with a massive surge of electricity, but he didn't die. It was the first known botched electrocution in American history. A local lawyer stepped in, arguing that putting the kid back in the chair constituted cruel and unusual punishment. He took it all the way to the Supreme Court. But the appeals failed. In 1947, Willie Francis was strapped back into the chair and killed. The Soviets weaponized stories like this at the United Nations. The Soviet representative, a brilliant international lawyer, sat right across from Eleanor Roosevelt on the UN Human Rights Commission. He publicly demanded that all progressive governments follow the Soviet example and ban the death penalty without exception. Western diplomats pushed back, of course. They pointed out that Soviet executions had mostly been used to purge political enemies anyway. But even Western journalists had to admit that taking the firing squad off the table was a massive shift. For almost 3 years, nobody in the Soviet Union was legally executed. Paulie America and his 10 accomplices got incredibly lucky. But the police probably didn't catch the whole crew. The guys who slipped the net likely formed new gangs and kept hitting stores. Or maybe new players stepped up to fill the void. The archives are mostly silent on this. What we do know for a fact is that in the years immediately following World War II, armed robbery became an absolute epidemic. In 1947, the government registered over 12,000 incidents of organized banditry. That was a 500% increase from before the war. The Minister of Internal Affairs reported to the top brass that in just the first 2 post-war years, they had liquidated over 3,000 armed robbery syndicates. And notice the word robbery. These weren't anti-government partisans fighting a guerrilla war in the western borderlands. These were straight-up criminals, thugs who had absolutely zero political ideology. For them, it was a golden era. The war was over, but the economy was entirely shattered. People were starving. The official estimates put the direct cost of the war's destruction at nearly 700 billion rubles, with total economic losses soaring past 2.5 trillion. It is almost impossible to wrap your mind around that number. Imagine the entire country working, paying taxes, and producing goods for 15 years straight, and then tossing every single dime of it into a roaring fire. That is what they lost. On top of the economic collapse, the police force was decimated. Millions of men never came back from the front lines. So it's no mystery why organized crime exploded. A crisis is a tragedy for the masses, but it's an opportunity for the predators. Some historians blame the massive 1945 victory amnesty for the crime wave, but that theory doesn't really hold up. Yes, they released over 700,000 people from the gulags, but they didn't just open the gates for murderers. A third of those released were locked up for labor desertion, basically walking off the job at a munitions plant during the war. Another third were serving short sentences for petty theft. These were not hardened, violent sociopaths willing to put 2 bullets into the back of a woman's head for a briefcase of cash. But what the streets did have was guns, millions of them. Remember Paulie America? He executed his victims with a captured German Luger. The statistics from that era are staggering. In just the first 2 years after the war, police confiscated 60,000 pistols and revolvers, nearly 30,000 submachine guns, and almost 170,000 rifles from gangs and ordinary citizens. If that's what the cops found, imagine what was still hiding under floorboards and in attics. The black market was flooded with both domestic and captured German hardware. The penalty for illegal gun possession was severe, 5 years in a labor camp. But that didn't stop anyone. So in a starving country awash with military-grade weapons, armed robberies skyrocketed. On March 11th, 1951, inside a smoky beer hall on the main northern highway out of Moscow, an off-duty cop saw a robbery going down. He drew his weapon and tried to intervene. He was shot dead. A civilian caught in the crossfire was also killed. 2 weeks later, another robbery on the outskirts of Moscow ended in a bloodbath. The manager of a store tried to fight back against a crew of armed men. He didn't stand a chance. They practically blew his head off. This happened in Kuntsevo, just down the road from Joseph Stalin's personal, heavily fortified compound. Stalin spent a massive amount of time at that dacha. In fact, when the Chinese leader Mao Zedong came to the USSR for a historic summit, that is exactly where he stayed. Because blood was spilled in the shadow of the dictator's backyard, this case immediately became a top national security priority. And once again, the terrified witnesses all described the exact same phantom. The leader was a tall, athletic blond man in a leather coat. The same guy seen at the beer hall shootout. The same guy seen at the grocery store murder a year earlier. His crew was made up of young, muscular guys. Was it really all the same gang? In June of 1951, at a suburban train station, a couple of beat cops noticed a group of young men drinking beer at the station buffet. One of the cops noticed a heavy, metallic bulge in one of the kids' pockets. It looked exactly like a pistol grip. The cops didn't want to start a firefight in a crowded room, so they waited outside on the platform. The second the kids walked out, they realized they were being watched. They instantly jumped off the platform onto the train tracks and sprinted into the dense woods. The cops chased them. The suspicion was dead on. The kids pulled their guns and started firing back. The gang vanished into the trees. But the cops survived, and they reported that the guy shooting at them was a tall, blond kid firing a military-issue TT pistol, the exact same weapon used in the string of unsolved murders. By the spring of 1952, this crew had pulled off at least 8 major, highly violent hits. They had been terrorizing the capital region for 2 straight years. They had murdered police officers. They had stolen hundreds of thousands of rubles. They had operated right under the nose of the Kremlin, and they had shot their way out of an ambush. The higher-ups were losing their minds. You have to know who was running Moscow and the surrounding region at that time: Nikita Khrushchev. This was his second stint running the capital. In the 1930s, he oversaw the massive construction of the Moscow metro. He's the guy who insisted on putting in those massive, terrifyingly deep escalators instead of elevators. He even tried to bring double-decker buses to Moscow, inspired by the British, but they kept hitting the overhead tram wires. After a brutal stint running Ukraine, they brought Khrushchev back to Moscow and made him a secretary of the Central Committee. It was a massive promotion, but he had enemies. Legend has it that Lavrenti Beria, the terrifying head of the secret police, was actively whispering in Stalin's ear about the crime wave. "Look at this mess, Comrade Stalin. Khrushchev can't even keep the streets safe." Beria was setting Khrushchev up to take the fall in the ruthless game of Kremlin succession. Some historians even suspect Beria's people actively sabotaged the police investigations just to make Khrushchev look incompetent. Whether that's true or not, Khrushchev was feeling the heat. He was absolutely furious about these unsolved robberies. He hauled the top police brass into his office, screaming at them, threatening to destroy their careers. And he wasn't bluffing. Police chiefs in the districts where the gang operated were fired and disgraced. Eventually, the investigation was taken out of local hands and given directly to the Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs. They formed an elite joint task force combining the best homicide detectives from the city and the toughest gang unit guys from the surrounding region. One of the men leading the hunt was Lieutenant Colonel Igor Skorin. He was a legendary detective who would later inspire a dozen crime novels and blockbuster movies. Skorin had cut his teeth hunting ruthless syndicates out in the lawless territories of the Russian Far East. Even thousands of miles away from the front lines of World War II, the Far East was bleeding from the post-war crime wave. Back in 1946, in the city of Chita, detectives finally took down a guy named Ivan Gerasimov. He was a career criminal who ran a crew that specialized in looting warehouses. They used the city's brutal, blinding sandstorms as cover to move through the streets unseen. They didn't have cars, so they literally wore their loot, putting on 3 or 4 stolen suits at a time and throwing a massive trench coat over the top to waddle back to their hideout. They finally got caught because they stole a cow. The cops heard a rumor about an illegal slaughter, kicked in a door, and found an old woman boiling a massive pot of beef bones. She cracked under interrogation. Turned out the sweet old lady was the gang's fence and chief accountant. It sounds like a dark comedy. So why does anyone remember this random crew of warehouse thieves from the edge of Siberia? Because of their name. They were known as the Black Cat Gang. Some say the criminals actually drew black cats on the walls with coal after a hit. Others say the locals just gave them the nickname, but the name stuck. In the local police archives, the reports read, "The Black Cat Gang is operating in the city, distributing propaganda leaflets under their syndicate's name." And then something bizarre happened. The Black Cat name went viral. Independent gangs in completely different cities started calling themselves the Black Cats. In the city of Ryazan, there were 2 separate, heavily armed Black Cat gangs operating at the same time. They were vicious. They actively hunted the detectives who were investigating them. They ambushed and executed a police officer in the lobby of a movie theater while he was standing with his family. These guys didn't draw cats on walls, but because they were deadly elusive and terrifying the public, just slapped the Black Cat label on them. The legend of the Black Cat spread across the Soviet Union like a virus through the underground grapevine. Wannabe thugs started drawing the symbol at crime scenes just to build their own street cred and send the cops chasing ghosts. If you dig into the National Police Archives, you will find dozens, maybe hundreds of official case files on gangs claiming the Black Cat name. One old-school mobster later claimed that in Moscow alone, there were at least 10 different crews using the name and thousands across the country. Where did the obsession with the symbol come from? The roots go all the way back to medieval Europe, where black cats were associated with witchcraft and the occult. In the Russian criminal underworld, the black cat tattoo had been a staple since the days of the czars. After the war, the symbol became an obsession for massive swarms of homeless orphans and street kids. They romanticized the gangster lifestyle. Most were just plain make-believe. The police would find terrifying, threatening letters signed by the Black Cat, only to track the handwriting to a 10-year-old kid trying to prank his neighbors. But sometimes the kids weren't playing. In late 1945, a crew of teenagers in Leningrad, using code names like Pirate Lemon and Ghost, actually signed a blood oath to form a Black Cat syndicate. They swore absolute loyalty to their teenage boss and promised to split all stolen goods equally. They managed to rob 3 apartments before the cops caught them in the act. So through sheer word of mouth, the Black Cat became a nationwide urban legend. It's like the Mandela effect. People were absolutely convinced there was one massive, highly organized mafia syndicate running the entire country, when in reality it was just a chaotic trend adopted by hundreds of disconnected, desperate people. This wasn't a Mexican cartel. It was a terrifying, decentralized meme. So how did this myth get permanently attached to the very real, very deadly gang of the tall blonde man terrorizing Moscow? During those years, one of the top gang detectives in Moscow was a young guy named Vladimir Arapov. During the war, he worked in a munitions plant, and in his spare time, he volunteered for the citizen militia. These weren't just neighborhood watch guys with flashlights. They were actively hunting armed deserters and violent thugs on the streets. Arapov was fearless. The police department noticed his talent and brought him on as a full-time homicide detective. Arapov was the guy who hunted down Paulie America. He went on to become an absolute legend in the department, hunting down the worst serial killers and mobsters of the era. He is universally recognized as the real-life inspiration for the hero in the famous Black Cat novel and movie. But the movie took liberties. The gang portrayed on screen a gritty, hardened mafia crew run by a terrifying mob boss was a total fabrication. It was a Hollywood-style composite of every post-war gang rolled into one. And the author called them the Black Cat Gang simply because it was the most recognizable criminal buzzword of the decade. The real-life crew that was shooting up Moscow didn't draw cats on walls. Nobody called them the Black Cats. They didn't steal food or clothes. They only wanted cold, hard cash. This disconnect between the cinematic myth and the ugly reality is a staple of criminal history. Take the legendary port city of Odessa. The post-war gangs there were the stuff of nightmares. There was a syndicate known as the Dodge Three-Quarters Gang. During the war, the U.S. shipped thousands of Dodge heavy-duty trucks to the Soviets under the Lend-Lease program. The trucks had a 3/4-ton payload capacity. The gang used one of these massive American military trucks to ambush farmers and merchants on the highways. They beat people to a pulp, sometimes to death, just to steal their flour, butter, and meat. These weren't just common thieves. Many of them were heavily armed military deserters. Some were former Nazi collaborators who had served in the brutal occupation police forces. We've covered the horrifying stories of these traitors before. When the war ended, these guys didn't change their morals. They just took off their Nazi armbands and became highwaymen. There was also the Morshuk gang in Odessa, 19 heavily armed men. They dressed in stolen military and police uniforms to set up fake checkpoints. They slaughtered at least 10 people, including several police officers. When the cops finally closed in, the legend says the gang leader bit down on a cyanide capsule rather than be taken alive. The myth claims the cops had to hunt the rest of the gang through the Odessa catacombs, a massive 2,000-kilometer labyrinth of underground limestone mines. A perfect place to hide a body or an entire army. There is another incredibly persistent myth from Odessa. The story goes that the military intelligence service sent elite death squads into the city at night. Men in plain clothes would walk the dark streets acting as bait. When a mugger pulled a knife, the intelligence officers would just draw their weapons and execute the thug right there on the cobblestones. No arrest, no trial, just a bullet to the brain. It makes for a great movie script. But in reality, there is zero documentary evidence that this ever happened. It's pure vigilante fantasy. The military did help the police, but it was standard stuff, manning checkpoints, riding in patrol cars, guarding prisoners. The cops in Moscow could have used that kind of military backup in the early 50s. Because despite the massive task force, the tall blond man's gang was completely out of control. In August 1952, they hit a tavern near a train station outside the city. The usual drill, everyone on the floor. But the 40-year-old security guard decided to be a hero. He made a break for the back room to grab his shotgun. He never made it. The crew shot him in the back. He died in the hospital. A month later, they executed 2 innocent men sitting in a pub just because they accidentally bumped into the robbers on their way out. In November, they hit a store near the Botanical Gardens. They grabbed 23,000 rubles. They shot the cashier in the shoulder but left her alive. It looked like a clean getaway, but as they walked down the street, a beat cop noticed them acting suspiciously. "Papers, please." "What for?" one of the robbers shot back. Words were exchanged, a gun was drawn, and another cop was left bleeding out on the pavement with a bullet in his skull. The detectives were tearing the city apart. They interrogated every known mobster, squeezed every informant, raided every underground gambling den. This crew had been operating for years, moving hundreds of thousands of rubles. Somebody in the underworld had to know who they were. But there was nothing. A total, impenetrable wall of silence. The cops staked out the massive black markets, hoping the gang would try to fence some stolen goods. Nothing. They reached out to police departments across the country. Maybe this crew wasn't from Moscow. Maybe they were a traveling syndicate coming into the city to strike and then vanishing back into the provinces. It was a solid theory. Remember the master forger who gave up Poly-America? That guy lived hundreds of miles away in Kazan. He supplied fake IDs to killers all over the country. And Kazan had its own absolute nightmare going on. In the fall of 1949, an old man walked into the office of the deputy prosecutor of the Republic. He was in tears. He claimed his son, a decorated war veteran, had just been sentenced to 25 years in the Gulag for a series of brutal robberies he had absolutely nothing to do with. The old man claimed the police had fabricated the evidence and tortured witnesses into lying. Normally, a complaint like that was a fast track to getting yourself arrested for quote-unquote slandering the state. The crimes in question began in 1945. A local thug named Vasily Kormakov decided to graduate from petty theft to murder. He took an axe and slaughtered a man and his wife in their own home just to steal their belongings. Kormakov realized he had a taste for blood. He built a crew. They recruited a 16-year-old kid and a hardened ex-con who supplied them with military hardware. They were completely devoid of human empathy. During a home invasion in 1946, a 4-year-old boy started crying. Terrified the noise would wake the neighbors, the gang murdered the toddler. In another horrific raid, they tunneled into the basement of a bank courier's home. The family woke up. The gang butchered the courier, his pregnant wife, his mother-in-law, and 3 young children. To avoid gunshot noise, they used hunting knives and crowbars. Another time, Kormakov dressed up in a police uniform and knocked on a door, claiming he had a warrant to search the house. His crew walked in behind him, acting as official witnesses. Once the door closed, they slit the homeowner's throat. Kormakov then raped a woman who was visiting the house before caving her skull in with a hammer. They had an inside man at a local factory who knew the exact route the female payroll clerks took. When one clerk refused to hand over the money bag, they put a bullet directly into her brain. The craziest part, the leader of this psychopathic death squad, Kormakov, had a day job. He was the chief of security at a musical instrument factory. He literally carried a state-issued revolver on his hip every single day. They were untouchable. When they bumped into police patrols at night, they just opened fire. They killed several cops and a soldier. Finally, in August 1949, the detectives tracked down Kormakov and his crew. They arrested them all. In the interrogation rooms, the gang started bragging. They confessed to everything: the slaughtered families, the pregnant women, the cops. But when the detectives looked at the files, their blood ran cold. A massive chunk of these murders had already been solved by the police department years ago. The local cops, desperate to close cases and look good for their bosses, had systematically framed innocent people. They had already sent 10 completely innocent men to the gulags for Kormakov's crimes. 2 of those innocent men had already died in the brutal camp conditions. One of the surviving innocent men was the war veteran whose father had gone to the prosecutor. When the local police brass realized what Kormakov was confessing to, they panicked. They actually went into the cells and demanded that the real serial killers retract their confessions so the police wouldn't get in trouble for the frame-ups. It took the deputy prosecutor risking his own life and career, bypassing the local authorities and taking the conspiracy straight to Moscow to blow the lid off the cover-up. The fallout was biblical. The dirty cops were arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison. The local prosecutor who rubber-stamped the fake cases was thrown in a cell. The Minister of Internal Affairs for the entire Republic was stripped of his rank and fired. As for Kormakov and his 17 accomplices, they were charged with over 50 counts of armed robbery and more than 20 murders. Even their relatives were arrested for hiding the weapons and fencing the bloody jewelry. The gang stood in the courtroom completely relaxed. They knew the law. The death penalty had been abolished. The worst they could get was 25 years in the camps. They would survive. But when the judge read the verdict, the words echoed through the room. Sentenced to death by firing squad. Kormakov lost his mind. He screamed at the judge, demanding to know how this was legally possible. Here is how. In January 1950, right as the trial was wrapping up, the government quietly brought the death penalty back. But there was a catch. It was only reinstated for treason, espionage, and counter-revolutionary terrorism. The prosecutors used the legal loophole. Because Kormakov's gang had murdered police officers and a soldier, the state classified those specific killings as terrorist acts against the representatives of the Soviet government. They transferred the case to a military tribunal which had the authority to issue death warrants. That exact same military tribunal was waiting for the tall blond man in Moscow, if the cops could ever find him. By January 1953, the pressure from the Kremlin was suffocating. The directive was clear: destroy this gang at all costs. And the detectives finally had a thread to pull. That one panicked phrase dropped during the bank robbery: "This is a stadium." When people are running on pure adrenaline, their brains default to what is most familiar. If a guy's brain instantly went to a stadium, it meant sports were a massive part of his life. The detectives looked at the map of the robberies. The pattern suddenly made sense. Almost every single hit took place within walking distance of a major sports complex or stadium in the northwest suburbs. They threw out the old playbook. They stopped looking at the criminal underworld. They sent plainclothes officers to every sports club, hockey rink, and soccer field in the region. Watch the athletes, watch the crowds. And then a bizarre report came in from the suburb of Krasnogorsk. A group of rowdy young guys had literally stolen a massive wooden barrel of beer from a street vendor near the local stadium. When the vendor started screaming for the cops, the guys laughed, apologized, handed her a massive wad of cash, and then started handing out free beers to everyone on the street. Young, athletic guys, throwing around huge amounts of unexplained cash, hanging out by a stadium, in the exact right neighborhood. The detectives moved in like ghosts. They didn't kick down doors yet. They watched. They learned that one of the kids in the beer keg crew, a university student, had taken a train to a hockey game in the exact town where the bank robbery happened on the exact same day. They looked at the student's best friend, a 26-year-old factory worker named Ivan Mitin. He was strikingly tall, he was athletic, he was blond, and he owned a tailored leather coat. In February 1953, the trap snapped shut. The task force hit multiple locations simultaneously. Ivan Mitin and his entire crew were taken down. Most of them were in their 20s. The arrests were completely anticlimactic. When the strike team breached Mitten's bedroom, he had a loaded pistol sitting right under his pillow. But the cops moved so fast he never even twitched. They took the most dangerous man in Moscow alive without firing a single shot. There was no dramatic undercover sting. There was no Hollywood-style standoff where the grizzled detective screams at the hunchbacked mob boss. The truth was far more disturbing. This was not a mafia syndicate. Mitin wasn't a criminal mastermind. He had a minor juvenile record for finding an old gun in the woods when he was 17, and another guy in the crew had been popped for stealing food as a teenager. But that was it. These weren't street thugs. These were the pride of the Soviet working class. Ivan Mitin had been working a factory lathe since he was 15. He worked at an elite top-secret aviation plant building engines for military fighter jets. He eventually transferred to the massive mechanical optics plant in Krasnogorsk, the same factory that built the legendary Zenit cameras. Mitin wasn't just a worker. He was a shift foreman. He was so productive, so dedicated to his job, that at the exact moment he was arrested for mass murder, his paperwork was sitting on a bureaucrat's desk nominating him for the Order of the Red Banner of Labor, one of the highest civilian honors in the country. The rest of the crew were exactly like him. They worked at the optics plant. They played on the factory's official hockey team. They studied at the university. They went to the factory clubhouse, drank beer, flirted with girls, and then sat in the corner and meticulously planned armed robberies. Their first hit was back in 1949. They broke into a store at night, stole some vodka and food, and got away clean. The rush of getting away with it was intoxicating. They escalated. The crew was fluid. Guys cycled in and out. The oldest member was a 40-year-old Stakhanovite, an elite, hyper-productive worker, and a proud member of the Communist Party. Supposedly, this guy was just sitting in a pub drinking a beer when Mitin's crew burst in to rob the place. He recognized Mitin, but instead of turning him in, the guy was so seduced by the thrill and the fast money that he asked to join the gang. He even brought in his relative, a retired military officer, who supplied the gang with military-grade weapons and hid their massive arsenal in the attic of a local teacher's college. Another core member was a 20-year-old university student and star hockey player named Vyacheslav Lukin. He was the one who panicked and yelled, "This is a stadium," into the phone. Over 3 years, 11 different men cycled through Mitin's crew. They pulled off over 20 armed robberies. Adjusted for modern inflation, they stole the equivalent of millions of dollars. But they also murdered at least 8 people, including 3 police officers. Just like the butchers in Kazan, the state charged Mitin's crew with terrorism against the government and threw them in front of a military tribunal. During the interrogations, Mitin was chillingly calm. Detective Arapov later wrote, "When I first saw Mitin, I wanted to shoot him myself. But when we sat down to talk, it was like looking at a different human being. He was calm. His eyes were sharp but friendly. It was actually pleasant to talk to him." Mitin confessed to everything. Yes, he robbed. Yes, he pulled the trigger. But he was deeply offended by the terrorism charge. "Why are you trying to paint me as some kind of political rebel?" he argued. "I loved my factory. I never betrayed my country. I didn't hate the cops. I only shot them because they were trying to arrest me. It was just business." Mitin even bragged that he was drinking buddies with half the local police force in his town. The local precinct only had 1 patrol car, so Mitin would constantly give the cops rides on his expensive imported BMW motorcycle. None of the cops ever bothered to ask how a factory worker could afford a luxury German bike. Mitin's right-hand man echoed the same sociopathic logic. "Hey, life is hard. I wanted to live beautifully. The devil tempted me. I didn't want to kill that cop. It was just survival instinct." The military tribunal didn't care about their philosophical excuses. Mitin and his trigger man were sentenced to death. In the fall of 1953, shortly after Joseph Stalin died, they were dragged in front of a firing squad and executed. The rest of the crew, including the hockey-playing university student, were shipped off to the gulags with 25-year sentences. Historians argue that the police took so long to catch Mitin because they were looking in the wrong universe. They were shaking down dive bars and mafia hideouts when they should have been looking at the Employee of the Month board at the local factory. But it's the exact same psychological blind spot we see with modern serial killers. Nobody wants to believe that the guy who butchers women on his lunch break is the same friendly, hard-working family man who always waves to the neighbors. These post-war gangs weren't driven by desperation. Mitin was making a great living. The Stakhanovite was a decorated party member. They killed because they realized they could. They killed for the absolute intoxicating rush of holding a loaded gun to someone's head and deciding if they lived or died. The media at the time completely buried the story. They couldn't let the public know that the perfect Soviet workers were actually bloodthirsty killers. But the streets talked. The rumors morphed into the legend of the Black Cat. Ivan Mitin personally executed at least 7 people. That is a higher body count than the Zodiac Killer. And yet, almost no one knows his name. You can argue that these men killed for cash, not for the twisted sexual gratification of a traditional serial killer. But the psychology is identical. They craved power. They craved superiority. Just like the worst serial killers in history, the men of this phantom Black Cat gang tasted blood, crossed the line into the dark, and found that they simply couldn't stop. And that is exactly why they have earned their place in our serial number. Until next time.